and record on this computer. And this is Male Entrepreneur Podcast, episode number 155. And we are live in 3, 2. All right. Welcome back to the Male Entrepreneur Podcast, the podcast for men who win, with your host, Purdeep Sangha. Purdeep, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing awesome, man. I'm just looking outside right now. The sun is shining. It's a beautiful, nice, chilly, cold winter day, but at least the sun is out. So I enjoy that.
Nice. We've got nothing but clouds here. But I'm glad you got some sunshine, though.
Yeah, it's always nice. It makes those winter days look just a little bit nicer.
All right. So what do we got lined up for this week's episode?
Well, we got a cool guest on today. I'm excited to have him on because he's got a wealth of knowledge. I love meeting people that just have life experience. It is so refreshing, and I get to pick up on little nuggets and learn little things. And I'm going to say this in the most respectful and polite way I can. Peter Wright is joining us here today, and Peter is a gentleman that has a very long tenure in experience and wisdom that I would like for him to share with his audience, but even for myself. And Peter, thank you for joining us here today.
No, thank you for having me on. And you and I spoke 10 days ago, and I enjoyed that conversation. And I'm really happy to be back and to meet Nathan as well. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And Peter, I'm going to say this as I said before, respectfully. You remind me a lot of the elders in my life, like my uncles and my grandfather, just a man of wisdom that just has a lot to share. And I think that's something that we, as I'm going to say, a younger generation, don't necessarily, how do I put it? I think we've lost the ability to take the wisdom from people that are older than us. People that have lived in different times. You've lived in different countries, and I want you to share that with us, because the knowledge that you have can be easily lost if we don't seek it. So I want you to share your story, please. Please share where you came from and some of the challenges that you went through in life.
I will do that, but I want to throw in a quick interjection on what you said, that I think my father and my grandfather, he died when I was young, but my father's generation would have criticized me when I was 30 and 40, and with almost exactly the same words that you've just spoken. So I think it's a generational thing that when each of us gets to that point, we look back and we realize life goes around in sort of circles. But I do agree with you that I think there's a danger, perhaps because there's so many other sources of information, that we will lose this wisdom, generational wisdom. But to get back to my story, which you wanted to hear, so the early part was pretty straightforward. I was born in London, England, in 1950, and England after the Second World War was a fairly grim place. There was still food rationing and rationing of clothes and this. My dad had left England in the 1930s to go to India with the British Army because after the First World War and after the Great Depression, job prospects were not too good. He didn't come from a wealthy family. When he went to India, he developed a love for the wide open spaces. He was in the British Army in a mounted regiment. I can't remember which one. So he spent most of his life on the back of a horse, which he thoroughly enjoyed. And then, of course, when Second World War came, he was in the North Africa and then in the Italian campaign. At the end of the war, he didn't know what to do. He signed up for the Palestine Police and again spent most of his life on the back of a horse and in the wide open spaces. Right, so that came to an end. He went back to England in 1948, 49, didn't really know what to do, and got into the British government service and then got into the Commonwealth Office. And in 1956, they gave him a posting to Rhodesia, as it was called, for 3 years. So my brother, who's 4 years younger than I, and my mother went on a ship for 3 weeks. My dad flew across, and in those days, it took 6 days with many stops to fly from London to Salisbury and Rhodesia. We went by ship and then trained from Cape Town. And it was an idyllic life for a kid. Cost of living was low. Climate was absolutely beautiful. My dad bought us horses. We lived right on the edge of the suburbs next to a farm where we could ride all over. At the age of 6 or 7, we would take off for an afternoon and no one would worry. That's just what kids did, into the bush. So it was a good life. But after 3 years, the British government said to my dad, your tour's ended. You've got to go back to UK. And he got an extension. And he pushed that for 9 years. And eventually I said, this is unprecedented. You cannot stay in one spot for more than 9 years. what they fear is that the British government servants will get too friendly with the locals and might,
interesting.
so that's why most of these in those days, colonial postings were 3 years, and then people moved on. But by that time, he'd rented a small farm, got more horses, got some cattle. They were breeding 2,000 chickens, supplying eggs all over the place. So he said, no, I'm not going back to UK. This is a good life for my boys. So he left and he went farming full time, but he never had capital to do it properly. So he then bought a bigger farm way out in the bush. I changed school. I love farming. All I wanted to do was farm. So I was lucky. I did well academically. I was in the top academic stream. I had a clear shot at university, could have got a bursary. My mother had visions of me being an international diplomat or, I don't know, high-powered banker or lawyer or something. And my dad wanted me on the farm and I wanted to farm and ride horses. So I chucked it all in and walked away from probably a free university education and went farming. But I found out that fathers and sons don't always work too well together.
Yeah, that's a big reason why I stayed out of our family business for a while.
And then, of course, in my late teens, early 20s, I suddenly discovered there were things called girls. So, but you don't get very far if you've got no money. And I was earning nothing on the farm. So long story short, I moved into the city and got a job in a sales admin position in a veterinary wholesale place and worked my way up. And then I started my own business. We had a terrorist war on. So another guy and I got a contract to manufacture and rot-proof sandbags for the army. So that was my first taste of entrepreneurship. And I kept my job, but this was a sideline. I managed to shoot out at lunchtime and before and after work to supervise my little factory. And then we made other things. We did quite well. Then, of course, the terrorist war got worse and there was lots of pressure on Rhodesia to hand over to black rule. And we saw the disaster that was happening all down through Africa. And we'd had the refugees from the Congo when they were being murdered staying with us. So our Prime Minister, Ian Smith, declared UDI, Universal Declaration of Independence, on 11th November 1965. Things got tough. We had sanctions, so you could only buy one brand of anything. Sometimes a little bit like this virus problem, we couldn't buy toilet paper. Gas was rationed. You had to have coupons to go and get gas for your car or diesel for your farm tractor. But it wasn't all bad. We survived. We had enough to eat. Christmas for kids was bleak. There was no money. There was no toys available, little wooden carved stuff. It didn't do them any harm, though. They could have a new shirt and a new pair of pants for Christmas instead of expensive toys. So it taught us a lot about being resilient, doing without, and it was a case of us against the world. The whole world virtually in public was against us. Behind the scenes, many of our enemies were quietly doing business with us. So we survived. But I think that was the start of this resilience and just making do, So tell me if I'm going too quickly or too slowly.
No, I just have a question there. When you say the whole world was against you publicly, can you just explain?
Sure. Politics is a sensitive business. I'll try and keep it as middle of the road as possible. There was this wave of independence in British and any Western power colonies after the Second World War, right? Because and some of it was well merited. There were bad things about colonialism. I'm not trying to say it was all good. The British colonies, I think, were better than some of the others. But Rhodesia, after South Africa, Rhodesia had the highest European and Asian or immigrant from first world nations population of any African country. We had about just under 400,000 whites, and I wouldn't know Indian and people of Indian and Asian descent, I wouldn't know, but probably another perhaps 10, 15,000, and mainly in trade and commerce, with an indigenous black population at that time of about 8 or 10 million, I guess. So we had a large presence of people from first world origins, let's put it that way. And when we saw what had happened in the rest of Africa, we said, we can't, we just can't envisage this happening to our country. So we declared UDI. So there were sanctions imposed by United Nations and all the other countries. South Africa and Portugal stood by us. The United States to a degree, but not completely. So as long as we had South Africa on our side, we were okay. We were landlocked. We had no port. So all our imports came through either South Africa or Mozambique, which was a Portuguese colony. When the coup happened in Portugal, which I think was in 73, 74, around about then, and the socialist regime came in, Mozambique was immediately given independence, and Frelimo, was it Frelimo? can't remember all the acronyms now, came into power. So immediately we no longer had an ally on our eastern border, and it became a resource and a haven for the terrorists who were causing havoc in our country. And eventually the rest of the world ganged up on South Africa. Sorry, at that time we had British naval blockade of Beira, the port in Mozambique where our oil came. So when that stopped our oil coming in, we switched to rail and road deliveries from South Africa. And eventually the rest of the world was starting to look at South Africa and apply sanctions there. And they were under pressure to close our border. And we had the ultimatum that if we did not negotiate to hand over, we would have the border with South Africa closed, and we would not get any gas, diesel, supplies, anything. We couldn't have survived after that. So this thing called the Lancaster House talks took place, or there was talks on a British destroyer, and it was agreed that we would hand it. Sorry, go back a step. We had already installed a multiracial government with an African bishop called Bishop Abel Muzorewa, who was prime minister. And it was a genuine multiracial government and well supported by black and white in Rhodesia. But because he advocated peaceful settlement and not violence, he was not accepted by the United Nations or the rest of Africa. He was seen as a puppet of the white man. So it was very sad. That would have worked. It was working. It would have worked. But it wasn't acceptable. So we were forced to hand over to Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo, who had been leaders of the terrorists that were fighting us. And there was supposedly elections, intimidation was huge, and it just got worse and worse. So once that was a foregone conclusion, I had 2 young kids to worried about education. I moved to South Africa before that happened in 1978.
And then, and so you spent some time in South Africa. Obviously, when did things change in South Africa?
Okay, so South Africa got off to a rough start because I moved in 1978 to South Africa. In August 1979, my parents were still, bearing in mind when I left Rhodesia, there was exchange control. We could take about 2 months' salary in cash with us to anywhere, South Africa, wherever we went. We could only take furniture and cars if we'd owned them more than 5 years. And my car was probably 9 years old at the time. So we left with very little to go to South Africa. I had a job for the company that I was working for. I sold my shares in my own business. My job fell through very quickly, but before that happened, my parents had stayed in Rhodesia. And in August 1979, my parents were on the way to the city of Mutare, which is now Mutare. It was called Umtali, on the eastern border, and they were ambushed. On the way home, they were ambushed by terrorists. My dad had a job. He'd retired from farming. He had a job called a water bailiff. He was on a large lake, and he just supervised or recorded how much water flowed in and how much went out to supply the city. It was nice for him. 3 or 4 hours work a day. Spent most of his time bass fishing, and he had a sort of mine-proof Land Rover government vehicle to drive. But it was really heavy, no power steering. So when they went to the city, he didn't want to drive that in traffic. They went in their civilian little Renault car, right? And my mother drove. And on the way back, they were ambushed, and 9 terrorists shot at them with AK-47s. And my mother was shot through the right hip. And the front right tire of the car was shot out, and most of the windows. But that caused the car to swerve to the right of the road under an embankment, and they were out of the line of fire. But the terrorists were still firing above them. So my dad got out. He was 65 years old, got out with his little Uzi 9mm submachine gun, ran up the road till he could see the terrorists, fired back, and they ran. They all ran, 9 of them. So that saved his life and my mother's life. And then he had a bad back, but he managed to lift her into the passenger seat, get in the car, drive it with a flat tire up the road to safety. And there was an army base not far away, and they'd heard the shooting. They came and rescued them. And it was only later we found out a bullet had gone through the ignition coil of that car, and yet it still started. It's unbelievable that it should have started. Yeah. So she was transported to Umtali Hospital. It was August. She was told she'd never walk again. There was so much of her femur had been shattered by this bullet. It had gone right through her, come out the other side, and the nerves were gone. And they said she could keep the leg, but it would be useless. She'd be in a wheelchair. And she was in hospital until the 30th of December that year, when my dad was on his way to visit her, and he got ambushed on the way there, and terrorists had pushed a bus across the road, and they were in the process of robbing and beating up all the local black people. And he came around the corner, he couldn't turn around, couldn't get his gun out in time. They walked up and shot him through the windshield. So he was killed at that second ambush. So there's my mother, who's now 56 years old, told she'll never walk again, lost her husband, lost her home, her country's going down the tubes, got no money, got no income, got nothing. You would think she'd give up, but she said, no, I'm going to fight this. So she got out of bed the first time into a wheelchair since August. So that's 4 months to go to my dad's funeral. And I flew up from South Africa. And it just shows you how, before the days of computers, how organized governments could be. When I got onto the Rhodesian government and said, I got no money, but I need to fly up for my dad's funeral, they said, let's verify it. Within about an hour, they'd organized plane tickets for me and my wife at the time. They said, what about your kids? Have you got anyone to leave them with? I said, no. Right, we'll put them on the plane. Do you need transport? I said, no, I've got family to pick me up at the airport. Everything done before computers, right? And you'll pick you'll pick your tickets up at the airport. It was all done by telex, can you believe? I mean, there weren't even fax machines in those days. So we flew up. And because of the terrorist war, Rhodesia was one of the leaders in the treatment of gunshot wounds and landmine injuries because of the war. So we had a rehabilitation center called St. Giles Rehabilitation Center. And my brother and I managed to get my mother there. I think it took 3 years, and they put her in a pool with a crane to get her into a pool, and she started walking in water. And once her wounds had healed, and eventually she was walking on 2 crutches with a caliper on the leg that she had no feeling in, and then canes, and then for much of her life she walked with not even a cane, right? She managed. So my brother had a small property and had a cottage on it, so my mother moved into there, and she lived there from 79, 80 to 2000. She went back to England, and she never gave up. And then she spent her life helping old people, and so that was a huge lesson for me.
So Peter, what do you say? We're going through a tough time right now with COVID. Mm-hmm. What we perceive to be tough. What you just told us and what you shared with us was almost like straight up from a movie. What would you say to the men out there that are listening that are feeling like they're going through a tough time right now?
This is nothing. People say to me, why aren't you worried about the virus? I said, when you've had, I'll get onto more fun that I had. I said, when you've had people pointing guns in your face and for days on end and threatening to burn your house and kill you, it's hard to get excited about a virus, which I've got more chance of surviving than being struck by lightning or hit by a car. So I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to the virus story. I don't want to get into that because it's so sensitive, but let's put the thing into perspective. I follow a site called Worldometer, which takes all the government statistics from all around the world. And I didn't look at it yesterday, but on Tuesday, I'm looking at my notes. There were 713 serious or critical cases of the virus, allegedly virus, in the whole of Canada with 38 million people, 713. So my feeling is we're ruining the economy and ruining the future for generations for an illness that's only got 713 critical cases. But that's why I'm not stressed about it. I'm just not stressed. You've got to put things into perspective. You've also, I believe, I'm a great believer in Stoic philosophy, and I read a book by Ryan Holiday called The Daily Stoic, which has got readings from Marcus Aurelius. Mm-hmm. What can you control and what can't you control? I can't control the virus, right? I can't control it. I can't even control what the government's doing about it at the moment. So I'm not going to lose sleep about it. I'm going to do the absolute best I can and get on with my life. That's it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm going to throw it over to Nathan if he has any questions.
I don't have any questions. I'm just going to say that, Peter, you just summed up my exact beliefs about all of it in like 30 seconds. So I don't have anything else to add to it. I know it's a controversial point of view, but I think you hit the nail. I think you hit the nail on the head.
So Peter, what are you doing right now then in terms of work or fun or play?
Okay, well, I'll just go a little bit more of my story to put it into perspective. So South Africa, the job fell through. My dad's just been murdered. My mother's in hospital. Life's fairly bleak. And I've got no money because of exchange control, but I got 2 kids to feed and a wife who was not that enthusiastic about working for herself. So there was the economy was not doing well. There was a recession on in South Africa. So I started selling wall coating, and that's going door to door to like the old fashioned encyclopedia salesman, right? Using my own car, getting paid commission only. Awful. But I managed to feed my kids for a year and keep a roof over their heads. And then I transitioned into life assurance, which was a little better, but still tough. Then I got back into commerce and in a big food products company. And over 10 years, I ended up as marketing manager. All the perks, big car, company car, and hotels and flying. And eventually the novelty of that wore off and I hit the glass ceilings. I'm a marketing guy now in a very accounting and engineering oriented company. So they looked at me as if I was from a different planet. So I left. I started an export trading business and a small factory of my own. And life was really good. And I bought a little country estate, had horses, 4 cars, the whole deal. Life was good for about 4 years. And then civil war broke out in Uganda and Angola, which were my 2 major markets. And long story short, I lost everything. I guaranteed all my company credit. I went bankrupt and I lost a lot. So, and because of the changes in South Africa, I couldn't sell my house. Squatters were moving in. So I gave, for the second time in my life, I did that when I left Rhodesia. I took the keys to the bank and I only had a small mortgage, said, take it over. And my brother was still in Zimbabwe as it become. He said, it's fairly stable, come back here. So I went back. My marriage was breaking up as well. Went to Zimbabwe, started all over again, and managed to start another business, sold that, met my current partner, took over her late parents' farm, put all the money sold the business, put the money into the farm. Life was good for about 10 years, and then we had all the upset in Zimbabwe where Robert Mugabe was, his hold on power was somewhat tenuous, so he decided to buy favor with the poverty-stricken peasants by kicking all the white farmers out, taking all our farms and putting landless peasants on the farms, which left them in an even worse position than they were in. And our farm was the second last in a district of 43 still operating. We employed 180 people at peak period. We had about 300 supported by the farm. And eventually we wouldn't leave. So the police, first we had weeks on end of a mob of 60 people marching around our security fence, lighting fires, threatening to kill us, beating on oil barrels all night so we couldn't sleep. And the police would do nothing. And eventually police came and got me. Well, they tried twice, failed. I went into the village. They got me in the village. Security police interrogated me for 5 hours. They didn't torture me, but it was interesting to say the least. And then they threw me in a jail cell of about 12 foot by 12 foot. The only white man amongst 27 black guys. So that was the least of my problems. That wasn't a problem, but it was awful. There wasn't enough room to lie down. There was an open pit down to a sewer in one corner. The smell was unbelievable. That's a whole story on its own. And then they took me into kangaroo court on the Monday and said, if you agree never to go back to your farm, we'll let you go. So that what could I do? So my eldest son had moved to Canada in 98. He said, come and look at Canada. So came to look, liked it, applied to immigrate. They said I could live here under humanitarian compassionate grounds while I applied. And that's how I ended up in Canada. So again, got no money from that farm. That's 3 properties in one lifetime that I've lost through politics. So that's a hard act to follow for anyone else to follow. So what am I doing now? Well, I came here and I started working on a farm because I'd been out of the corporate world and management way too long. I didn't know anyone in Canada. I had no money. So I was on a farm doing exactly very much what I did, what I had employed people to do in Zimbabwe for many more hours a day than I ever made my guys work. And but for more money, admittedly. So I survived, and then in 2010 had a heart attack, and they said no more farming. And I'd been smart. Instead of being an employee, I had that desire to work for myself. I worked for a couple of different farmers at the same time. So I set up a little business and I worked as a contractor. So of course, when I couldn't work, the income stopped. There was no unemployment benefit, nothing. So I'd already started fiddling around on the internet. So I've been writing blogs, I wrote a book and doing some freelance writing, public speaking, odd jobs here and there. And that's what I still do. And I run my own podcast like your one, and it's called The Yakking Show. And I enjoy life. And I walk every morning, keep fit. Yeah, life's good.
And so what's the name of your book?
It's called 5 Steps to Thriving on Adversity. But sadly, I'm out of print. I'm about to publish as an ebook, and my printer's gone out of business during the shutdown. I can't get, they've gone. They closed their website. So I'm going to have to get another printer or put it on print on demand or something. So I'll be doing that soon. But I've taken all these sales, the order forms off my websites at the moment because I'm out of stock. So
I might have a printer for you. We can connect up after that. I can share.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah, local printer. But so this book, and I know we're coming up soon here. We got to wrap it up in a couple of minutes. But I think this book and what you just shared with me, man, I want to have you back on because I want to hear more of the details. So this is amazing. But it for me, it touches my heart because you are a man that has gone through this multiple times. It sounds like 3 times, to say the least, to start from scratch, and not from small things. We're talking about big things. We're talking about, just the losses that you've had, being arrested, all that kind of stuff, losing everything. I can't imagine what you've gone through, but that for me shares a story of hope.
Oh, yes.
Of resilience, as you said, getting through adversity. And I'm hoping that you out there listening to this gentleman share this. One thing I'm hoping is that people read your book. That's one thing. I hope people pick up your book. I hope you share that book. I hope you share your story, Peter, because there's so many guys out there that can use it right now.
Yeah, I will do that as best I can. And it's possible. I'm a living example. I'm not a hero at all. People have been through far worse than me. One of my other heroes is Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. I read that several times, and that should be read by everybody. Anyone who's worried about the future or the situation, go and read that book. Then you know you've got nothing to worry about.
Absolutely. And so Peter, where can people go to find out more about your book or what you do, your blog?
Okay, 2 places. The best one is my personal blog, which is peterwrightsblog.com, with no apostrophe, all one word, no apostrophe. And they can pick up quite a lot on The Yakking Show on YouTube, and it's on Podbean and most of the podcast channels. But Peter Wright's blog's got more of my story.
Okay, awesome. And Nathan, I'm going to throw it over to you.
All I'm going to say is this has been one of my favorite conversations to sit in on in a long time. And I appreciate your story, and I'm glad that you came on the show to share it with us. And if people want to check out more of this podcast, Purdeep, where can they go?
Well, you can check out mailpodcast.com or youtubeformen.com.
And okay, fantastic episode, guys. Thank you so much for putting this together. And until next time, we will catch you later.